The moment Leonardo DiCaprio's back hit the cold marble floor, a stunned silence swept through the showroom like a shockwave, as if the entire world had paused to process what had just happened. Seconds earlier, the air had been thick with quiet humiliation, the kind that clung to the edges of polite conversation, concealed in the carefully measured tones of men who believed power was measured by the weight of their wallets. Now, that thinly veiled disdain had turned into something raw, something ugly, something that left a man sprawled on the floor of a place that prided itself on exclusivity. DiCaprio didn't move immediately, not because he was hurt, though the force of the manager's shove, followed by the sharp knuckles colliding with his ribs, had been more than just for show, but because he wanted to absorb it, to feel the weight of what had just happened, to let the finality of the moment settle in before deciding what came next. Above him, the manager, Richard, a man with too much pride and too little patience, stood rigid, his breathing heavy, his fists still clenched, as if expecting some kind of retaliation. But there was none. Not yet. You think you can walk in here and waste my time? Richard's voice, sharp as cut glass, cut through the silence, bouncing off the pristine walls, the gleaming chrome, the polished vehicles that bore the sin of money and status. This isn't a place for dreamers, and it sure as hell isn't a place for people who think they can demand respect just by standing in front of something they'll never afford. DiCaprio's fingers pressed against the floor as he slowly sat up, exhaling through his nose, the movement unhurried, deliberate, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience, as if he had all the time in the world. He could hear the murmurs now, hushed voices rippling through the room like static, employees shifting in place, uncertain whether they should intervene, customers pretending not to watch but failing miserably, a few even gripping their phones a little tighter, debating whether this moment was worth capturing. A younger salesman, clearly nervous, took an uncertain step forward before hesitating, his eyes darting between DiCaprio and the manager, as if caught between instinct and fear. "Sir, maybe we should stay out of this," Richard snapped, his tone laced with finality, his shoulders squared with the confidence of a man who had spent years deciding who mattered and who didn't. He had his chance to leave quietly. Now he can crawl out. DiCaprio ran a hand over his ribs, testing for anything worse than bruises, before finally meeting Richard's gaze with something unreadable, something that made the man hesitate for just a fraction of a second. He recognized that look, but he didn't understand it, not yet. It wasn't anger, it wasn't humiliation, and it sure as hell wasn't fear. It was something far worse for a man like Richard. It was patience. "You really don't know who I am," DiCaprio said finally, his voice steady, carrying no hint of the amusement he might have otherwise let slip. It wasn't a question, just an observation, just a realization that Richard hadn't even considered the possibility that the man he had just thrown to the ground might be someone who could make him regret it. Richard scoffed, shaking his head, arms folding across his chest in a show of dominance. "I don't need to know who you are. I know what you are. You're another nobody who walked in here thinking he could play pretend, another guy who thought walking around with confidence was enough to make us forget what you really are. And you know what?" He smirked now, shifting his weight slightly, casting a glance at the audience he knew was hanging onto every word. "It doesn't matter how much you stand there and pretend. You don't belong here. You never did." DiCaprio exhaled slowly, pressing his palm against his knee as he pushed himself to his feet, not bothering to dust himself off, not looking away, not giving Richard the satisfaction of anything resembling a reaction. He simply smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't forced. It wasn't the kind of smile a man wore when he was amused or entertained. It was the kind of smile that came before something inevitable, something irreversible, something that Richard, whether he realized it or not, was about to learn the hard way. And then, before anyone could process what was happening, the sound of a phone camera shutter sliced through the air, sharp and undeniable. The moment had just been captured, and the world was about to see it. The weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like a physical force, pressing down on every person in the showroom, forcing them to decide whether to look away or let their curiosity consume them. The manager stood firm, his jaw set, his confidence not yet faltering, but something in his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of realization, a quiet, creeping doubt that came with the understanding that the moment had already slipped out of his control. He hadn't noticed the phone being raised, hadn't registered the faint click of the camera in time to stop it, but now it was too late, and the evidence existed beyond the walls of this showroom, beyond the limits of his authority, beyond the reach of whatever arrogance had convinced him that he was untouchable. DiCaprio's posture remained unchanged, his expression locked in something dangerously neutral, his hands still relaxed at his sides, his breathing steady despite the impact that still echoed through his ribs. He could feel the eyes on him, scanning him for a reaction, waiting for some kind of retaliation, something loud, something aggressive, something that would justify the way he had been treated. But there was nothing, no raised voice, no threats, no demands. He simply looked at the man in front of him as if trying to understand the exact moment when he had made the choice to humiliate someone for no reason other than his own misguided sense of superiority. Richard was the first to speak, his voice breaking the silence with an edge of forced control, as if he still believed he had the power to rewrite the moment before it spiraled into something beyond repair. "If you're expecting some kind of apology, you're wasting your time," he said, his tone sharp, his stance unyielding. "You came in here pretending you belonged, and now you're standing there like you think any of this changes the fact that you don't." He let out a short, humorless laugh, though the sound rang hollow against the stillness in the room. "You can walk out now, or you can get thrown out again. Your choice." DiCaprio exhaled slowly, barely reacting, barely acknowledging the man's words as anything other than noise. He could feel the shift happening around him, could see the employees shifting uncomfortably in their places, their expressions caught somewhere between reluctance and anticipation, none of them willing to step forward. None of them willing to challenge the man who had built his authority on intimidation alone. Even the customers, the ones who had once been passive observers, now stood still, waiting for something, though they likely didn't even know what. Then, a voice cut through the tension, steady but filled with something that carried more weight than any of the empty arrogance the manager had been throwing around. "I think you should check your phone," the younger salesman said, the same one who had hesitated earlier, the same one who had almost spoken up before being shut down. His voice was quieter than Richard's, but it carried something stronger, certainty, finality, the weight of someone who already knew what the outcome was going to be. Richard turned, his brow furrowing, his irritation now sharpened into something more dangerous. "What did you just say?" The salesman didn't flinch, didn't back down, didn't let the weight of the moment crush him the way the others had. "Check your phone," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "Because if you don't, you'll be the last person in this room to realize what just happened." Richard's fingers twitched at his side, a muscle in his jaw tightening as he pulled his phone from his pocket, his confidence still intact but beginning to fray at the edges, the first hints of doubt creeping into the way his shoulders squared, the way his breath hitched slightly as he unlocked the screen. His eyes scanned the notifications, the flickers of movement across his face betraying his attempts to maintain control. It was already happening, already out of his hands, already beyond whatever damage control he thought he could impose. The video had been posted, the image had been shared, and the world had already begun forming its own opinion before he could even open his mouth to justify himself. DiCaprio watched him, his expression unchanged, his patience unwavering, as Richard's grip on his phone tightened, as his shoulders tensed, as the weight of the moment finally began pressing down on him the way it had pressed down on everyone else. The arrogance hadn't faded yet, but the certainty had. "You think some stupid video is going to change anything?" Richard spat, his voice tinged with something new, something closer to desperation. "You think people like you can walk in here, take a picture, post it online, and suddenly the world is on your side?" He shook his head, his laughter now edged with something frayed and uneven. "This will be forgotten in a day. No one cares." DiCaprio tilted his head slightly, studying him in silence, before finally speaking. "Then why do you look so nervous?" His voice was calm, measured, completely devoid of the anger Richard was expecting, but the words cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. The silence that followed was heavier than before, more suffocating, more final. The showroom had transformed from a stage where Richard controlled the narrative to something entirely different, something he no longer held in his grasp. He was beginning to see it now, beginning to understand that this was no longer just a moment between him and the man he had dismissed, no longer just an insignificant display of power meant to put someone in their place. This was something else entirely. DiCaprio shifted slightly, exhaling as he adjusted his stance, his ribs still aching but his resolve unshaken. He didn't need to do anything more, didn't need to say anything louder. The world had already decided for itself, and Richard was beginning to realize that he had already lost. The realization that he was no longer in control settled in Richard's expression like a slow, creeping weight, his fingers gripping the phone tighter as his eyes scanned the endless stream of comments and reposts. The rapid flood of reactions from people who had already seen the video, who had already formed their opinions, who had already begun the process of tearing apart everything he had built his reputation on. His breath hitched slightly, the first visible crack in the carefully curated mask of authority he had worn so confidently just moments before, the slight furrow of his brow betraying the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The way his jaw tensed as if he were still trying to hold on to whatever remnants of control he thought he had left. DiCaprio remained still, his gaze unwavering, his posture unchanged, as if waiting to see just how long it would take for Richard to truly understand the magnitude of what had just happened. The room around them had not returned to normal, the atmosphere still heavy with something that no one wanted to break, the employees frozen in place, the customers lingering in the corners, all of them unwilling to move, unwilling to be the first to act, unwilling to do anything that might shatter the tension that had locked the space in an eerie stillness. Richard finally lowered the phone slightly, exhaling through gritted teeth, his voice carrying an edge of something sharper, something closer to anger now, something laced with the bitter taste of a man who had never considered the possibility of losing. "You really think this matters?" His tone was no longer dismissive, no longer amused, no longer carrying the easy arrogance he had used to assert himself before. It was something else now, something that carried the unmistakable weight of a man scrambling for footing he had already lost. "You think some video changes anything? You think the people watching this know what actually happened? They don't know me. They don't know you. They don't know anything except what they want to believe." DiCaprio didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't give Richard the satisfaction of any outward sign that the words had reached him. He simply watched, letting the silence stretch long enough for Richard to feel it, for the absence of immediate validation to press down on him in a way that words never could. It was a silence that left no room for negotiation, no space for justifications, no opportunity to shift the blame elsewhere. It was the kind of silence that made a man confront himself, that forced him to sit with the reality of what he had done, that stripped away the excuses and left nothing but the truth. Richard let out a sharp breath, shoving the phone back into his pocket as if the action alone could somehow erase everything it had just shown him, as if ignoring it could change the fact that the damage had already been done. His frustration was now visible in every movement, the tightening of his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw, the way his fingers twitched as if fighting the urge to lash out again, as if still clinging to the belief that force could undo what had already unraveled before him. "People like you always think you can get away with this," Richard continued, his voice lowering slightly, as if he still believed he had the power to turn the moment in his favor, as if he thought there was still a chance to regain the upper hand. "You walk in here acting like the rules don't apply to you, expecting everyone to treat you like you're special just because you think you deserve it." His gaze narrowed, his lip curling slightly in barely concealed disdain. "But you're nothing. You're just another entitled." A voice interrupted him before he could finish, but it wasn't DiCaprio's. "That's Leonardo DiCaprio." It was quiet at first, spoken by a man standing near the back of the room, a customer who had remained silent up until this moment, who had watched the scene unfold with the same mixture of unease and disbelief as everyone else. But those three words carried more weight than anything that had been said before them, slicing through the tension with an undeniable finality, forcing everyone in the room to recalibrate their understanding of what was happening, of who they had just witnessed being thrown to the ground, of what that meant for the man who had done it. Richard blinked, his breath hitching slightly, his expression faltering just enough to reveal the moment of realization, the moment where all the pieces clicked into place, the moment where he understood, not just who he had just humiliated, but what that meant for him, for his dealership, for the carefully built reputation he had spent years cultivating. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out, the weight of the moment rendering him momentarily speechless, the shock settling in his bones, the recognition flickering across his face like a man who had just witnessed his entire world shift in an instant. The silence stretched even further now, thick with something unspoken, something irreversible, something that left no room for the arrogance Richard had carried so effortlessly just moments ago. The customers in the showroom began exchanging glances, whispers spreading like wildfire, expressions shifting from passive interest to something closer to shock, to disbelief, to quiet outrage. Employees who had once been hesitant now stood completely still, the realization sinking in, the understanding that they had all just been part of something much bigger than they had initially thought. Richard swallowed hard, forcing himself to straighten his posture, attempting to regain some semblance of composure, but the damage had already been done, the power dynamic already irreversibly shifted. He wet his lips, his voice finally returning, though it lacked the force it once held. "Look, Ayo." DiCaprio finally moved then, stepping forward just enough to close the space between them, his expression still unreadable, his presence now heavier, more commanding. No longer simply existing in the room, but now taking up space in a way that left no room for dismissal. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show even a flicker of the anger he had every right to feel, but when he spoke, it was with the kind of finality that left no room for argument, no room for excuses, no room for anything but the weight of the truth. "You hit me." His words were calm, measured, almost unnervingly steady. "You threw me to the ground. You humiliated me in front of your employees, in front of your customers, because you thought I wasn't worth your time." He let the words settle, let them take root in the silence, let them be fully absorbed before delivering the part that mattered most. "And now, you have to live with that." Richard's breath came unevenly now, his face pale, his confidence completely stripped away, his authority no longer something he could command with mere presence alone. He had spent his life believing that power was about control, about deciding who mattered and who didn't, about dictating the terms of respect. But now, in this moment, he understood something that he had never considered before. He had never had power at all. Richard's breath was shallow now, his entire body rigid, his hands still clenched at his sides as if he could somehow hold on to the last remnants of control that had already slipped through his fingers. His mind raced, searching for a way out, some kind of justification, some excuse that would make this moment disappear, but there was nothing, no words, no explanation, nothing that could undo what had already happened. The weight of the room pressed in on him, the silence no longer one of anticipation but of judgment, the realization settling in that everyone in this space had already decided what they believed, and none of it was in his favor. The customers were no longer hesitant in their reactions, their eyes now filled with something closer to disgust, their murmurs turning into quiet but undeniable condemnation. Some shook their heads, others exchanged looks, a few pulled out their phones again, scrolling through the rapidly spreading posts that were now dominating their feeds. The employees, once indifferent, now looked visibly uncomfortable, a few shifting their weight as if they no longer wanted to be associated with the man who had, just minutes ago, commanded the entire room without question. DiCaprio hadn't moved, hadn't said another word after his last statement, but he didn't need to. The weight of his presence alone was enough to keep the pressure on, his steady, patient stare forcing Richard to sit in the consequences of his own actions without an easy way out. The man who had built his authority on intimidation and dismissal was now the one being measured, the one being judged, the one who had lost the ability to dictate the terms of the conversation. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, his pulse hammering in his ears, and when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the confidence it had carried before, the sharpness replaced with something forced, something hollow. "You don't understand," Richard started, his tone strained, his gaze flicking around the room as if searching for someone, anyone who might still be on his side. This was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were. If I had known, I never would have." DiCaprio let out a slow, quiet breath, and though his expression didn't change, there was something in the way he shifted his weight slightly, something almost imperceptible, that made Richard stop mid-sentence. There was no anger in his eyes, no outward frustration, no need to argue, but there was something far worse, disappointment. The realization hit Richard like a blow, the understanding that this wasn't just about what he had done, but about what he had revealed about himself in the process. It wasn't about recognizing DiCaprio's face too late. It was about the fact that he had only cared once he did. "That's the problem," DiCaprio said finally, his voice calm, steady, devoid of the need to prove anything. "You didn't think I deserved respect until you thought I could hurt you." Richard stiffened, his lips pressing together in a thin line, his pride still fighting to keep him from acknowledging the truth of those words. His entire life, he had been the one in control, the one who dictated how people were treated, the one who decided who mattered and who didn't. And now, in the span of a few minutes, the entire structure he had built for himself had collapsed under the weight of something he couldn't manipulate: public perception. He had spent years believing power came from authority, from dominance, from making people understand their place. But now, he was the one who had been placed under a spotlight he couldn't escape from, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to be powerless. A voice from the crowd cut through the silence again, sharper this time, carrying the kind of certainty that couldn't be ignored. "People like you always say it was a misunderstanding after you've already been caught," the customer who had first recognized DiCaprio said, his tone edged with something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't far from it either. "You only care because now everyone's watching." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, quiet but undeniable, the shift in the energy unmistakable. Richard could feel it now, the way the room had turned against him in a way that was no longer just about this moment, but about everything it represented. about every person who had ever been treated the way DiCaprio had been treated, about every time power had been used to humiliate instead of uplift. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to argue, but the words didn't come, because there was no defense, no argument, no way to change the reality of what had just happened. DiCaprio didn't say anything else, didn't need to. He took one final look at the man in front of him, then turned his gaze toward the employees, his expression unreadable but his meaning clear. He wasn't asking for an apology. He wasn't asking for retribution. He was simply letting them decide what they wanted to do next, forcing them to choose between standing beside a man who had built his authority on dismissal or acknowledging the truth of what they had just witnessed. A beat of silence passed, then another, and then, without warning, the younger salesman, the one who had spoken up earlier, the one who had already begun to break away from the culture of fear Richard had cultivated, took a step forward. He hesitated only briefly before reaching up, unclipping the small silver name tag pinned to his suit jacket and placing it carefully on the counter in front of him. The action was quiet, unceremonious, but it was loud in its finality, in the choice it represented. He wasn't going to be part of this anymore. Another employee followed, then another, and within moments, 4 of them had placed their name tags on the counter, standing side by side in a silent act of rejection, their gazes locked on Richard, waiting for him to understand what had just happened. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that no matter how he treated people, his authority would protect him. But now, he was watching that authority disintegrate in front of him, slipping away piece by piece, each act of defiance a reminder that he no longer had the control he once did. Richard took a step back, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly at his sides, his mind still scrambling for a way out, for some way to salvage what had already been lost. But there was nothing left. No power. No control. No respect. DiCaprio watched him for a moment longer, then turned without another word, his movements unhurried as he walked toward the exit, leaving behind the weight of everything that had just transpired. The silence in the room remained heavy, unbroken, the absence of his presence only making the reality of what had just happened more suffocating. The doors swung open, the cool air of the city rushing in as DiCaprio stepped outside, disappearing into the crowd, blending back into the world as effortlessly as he had entered. But the moment he left behind would not disappear with him. It would stay. It would spread. And Richard would have to live with the consequences. Because for the first time in his life, he had been the one dismissed. The fallout was immediate, unstoppable, and far worse than Richard could have imagined. Within hours, the video had reached platforms beyond his control, spreading at a speed that no amount of damage control could contain. It wasn't just a moment caught on camera anymore. It had become something larger, something people had attached meaning to, something that resonated far beyond the showroom floor where it had all begun. The comments flooded in relentlessly, dissecting every second, every word, every expression. It wasn't just about the fact that he had physically thrown a man out of his dealership. It was about everything that moment represented, the arrogance, the dismissal, the way respect had been treated as something conditional, something that could be withheld or granted based on appearances alone. And now, the world was watching, and they had already decided where they stood. The dealership's phone rang nonstop, customer after customer calling, not to buy, but to demand answers, to voice their outrage, to let the company know that they wanted nothing to do with a place that treated people like this. Emails flooded in. Social media pages were bombarded with backlash, and the once exclusive reputation Richard had worked so hard to cultivate crumbled beneath the weight of public scrutiny. Wealthy clients who had once been regulars sent messages cutting ties, not because they cared about DiCaprio personally, but because they knew what association with a scandal like this would do to their own image. It was no longer about luxury or status, it was about perception, and in the world Richard had built his business around, perception was everything. The owner of the dealership, a man who had always operated from behind the scenes, had remained silent for most of the day, letting the chaos unfold while he assessed the damage. But by evening, it was clear that silence was no longer an option. He arrived without warning, stepping into the once pristine showroom that now felt smaller, colder, its luxury reduced to nothing under the weight of the scandal unfolding within its walls. Employees who had once moved with confidence now stood in awkward silence, unsure of where they fit in this new reality. Richard, standing stiff near the counter, barely looked up when the man entered, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the truth. He knew what was coming. The owner's voice was calm but absolute, the kind of tone that left no room for argument, no space for negotiation. "I need your keys." The words cut through the room like a blade, sharp, direct, inescapable. Richard's fingers twitched, his grip tightening slightly on the counter, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew this wasn't a conversation. It was a statement of fact. Richard finally looked up, his face pale, his mouth opening slightly as if he wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to find some way to shift the blame, but there was nothing left to say. He had built his position on control, on authority, on the belief that he could decide who mattered and who didn't. But today, he had learned the hard way that power wasn't something you simply claimed. It was something people allowed you to have. And today, no one was allowing it anymore. The keys made a faint metallic sound as they were placed on the counter, a small, simple gesture that carried the weight of everything Richard had just lost. He hesitated for only a second before stepping back, his movement stiff, his pride still forcing him to keep his posture straight even as his world collapsed around him. He didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't lash out. He simply turned and walked out the same door DiCaprio had walked through hours earlier. But unlike DiCaprio, no one watched him leave with respect. By the next morning, the dealership had issued a public statement, one carefully crafted by a team of people who knew that no amount of apologies could undo what had already been done. They distanced themselves from Richard, denounced his actions, assured the public that this was not representative of their values. But it didn't matter. The damage was irreversible, the trust broken, the exclusivity that had once been their selling point now a stain on their name. Customers didn't want reassurances, they wanted consequences. And they had already decided what those consequences should be. Meanwhile, DiCaprio had remained silent, his phone buzzing with calls and messages, people reaching out, news outlets requesting interviews, companies eager to align themselves with him in an attempt to capitalize on the moment. But he ignored all of it, uninterested in the spectacle, uninterested in feeding into the cycle of outrage and redemption that played out in the media every day. He had no interest in revenge, no need for validation. What had happened had already spoken for itself. Instead, he spent the day doing exactly what he had planned to do before any of this had unfolded, finding the car he had been looking for. He didn't need a showroom filled with luxury to find something meaningful. He found it in a smaller dealership, one that didn't measure worth by the brand of shoes a customer wore, one where the owner greeted every person who walked through the door with the same level of respect. He bought the car without ceremony, without making a statement, without turning it into anything more than it was, a simple transaction with someone who had treated him the way people should be treated. And then, just as quietly as he had entered the story, he left it. The world moved on, as it always did, but the moment remained, not because it was attached to his name, but because it had become something else entirely. It had become a reminder, a lesson, a quiet shift in the way people thought about respect and power and the way they chose to wield it. It wasn't about one man losing his job or one dealership facing consequences. It was about something much larger, something that would linger in the back of people's minds the next time they found themselves in a position of judgment, the next time they looked at someone and made a decision about their worth before even speaking to them. For Richard, the consequences would last much longer than the headlines. He would carry them in the way people looked at him now, in the way his name had become a cautionary tale, in the way doors that had once opened for him without question now hesitated before letting him in. He had spent his entire career deciding who mattered. And now, the world had decided that he didn't.